Hello friends. So look at the names here. John Donne, Martin Luther, Utopia, King Lear. What are we talking about? Essentially we are talking about um, the 15th and the 16th centuries. We are already uh, almost there in the Renaissance age, especially in the English Renaissance. So, this is what we are going to talk about today and other things as well. Let's just assume that we are gradually moving towards the reign of Elizabeth I, the accession of Queen Elizabeth I. Okay, so we are moving towards that. But then, of course, I would also like to touch upon King Lear because the other day we were talking about Hamlet. So I thought it's prudent to talk about two great tragedies. We have already um, hinted at or scratched the surface of one of his greatest histories, Henry IV, Part 1. So you ought to know all these works, these plays, in order to ace your exams. Now, let's start with your exercises. So, look at the first slide here. Read the following quotes taken from a book. These are all one single book. Sire, enjoy the peace that gives you good fortune. Grow the kingdom of your fathers. Let them bloom happiness, wealth, and strength. Love your subjects, and their love makes you happy. Live in father among them, and do not order ever despot then. Let the other realms, one that you have gotten an inheritance, is large enough for you. Next quote from the same book. The princes think only of war, art unknown to me, and I have no desire to know. Beneficent, they neglect the arts of peace. Is it to conquer new realms? Any means they are good. The sacred and the profane, crime and the blood does not stop them. Third quote. Philosophy has no access to the courts of princes. Identify the book. The Prince, Maud Arthur, Utopia, The Social Contract. Next slide, please look at it. Who is the speaker here? Why does not the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with his own money rather than with the money of poor believers? Who said that? Look at the options. A. Thomas More, B. Thomas Cranmer, C. Henry VIII, D. Martin Luther. Third one, identify the play by Shakespeare. When shall we three meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly is done, when the battle is lost and won. Choose the right answer. Macbeth, King Lear, Othello, Hamlet. Next one. Identify the play. The reward of sin is death. That's hard. Si pecus negamus falimer, Enula e in nobis veritas. If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and there is no truth in us. Why then belike we must sin and so consequently die? Ay, we must die an everlasting death. What doctrine call you this? Shesarasara, what will be shall be. Divinity, adieu. These metaphysics of magicians are and necromantic books are heavenly. Who said that? A. Hamlet, B. Every man in his humour, C. Tamburlaine, D. Dr. Faustus. Look at the period, look at the age we are in, and look at the conflict that the speaker is having. Theology and worldly pleasures. This was a very persistent theme in all literatures of this period. Next, please look at the slide here. Read the passage. Hail to the world, soul and mine, more glad than is the teeming earth to see the longed for sun peep Through the horns of the celestial ram am I to view this splendor, darkening his, that lying here amongst my other hosts shows like a flame by night, or like the day struck out of chaos, when all darkness fled unto the centre. O thou son of Saul, but brighter than thy father, let me kiss with adoration thee and every relic of sacred treasure in this blessed room. Go through the passage carefully. And here are your choices. Identify the writer: Christopher Marlowe, Robert Greene, Ben Jonson, William Shakespeare. It's a very important play by an extremely important dramatist. Next one. Read the excerpt below. When thy inconsiderate hand flings ope this casement with my trembling name, to look on one whose wit or land new battery to thy heart may frame, then think this name alive, and that thou thus in it offend'st my genius. Who could be the poet here? Here are your choices. Identify the poet: A. George Herbert, B. John Donne, C. Andrew Marvell, D. Richard Crashaw. And the answers are: first one, the quotes that I had given you about king and kingliness and politics and princes, that is C. Utopia by Sir Thomas More. The remark on the Pope and his wealth, answer is D. Martin Luther from Germany. We are already into Reformation, the Great Reformation. Third is A. Macbeth. We three meet the three witches of Macbeth. And the fourth one is D. Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, an extremely important writer for international exams purposes. And so is your fifth writer. Answer is C. Ben Jonson in Volpone. The poem is, or the sixth question, the poem is by John Donne, A Valediction of My Name in the Window. Remember, John Donne is an extremely important poet for international exams and also for national exams. He has assured his place in the history of English literature. A very respected figure and a very frequently occurring figure in literature and exams. John Donne was born in 1572. So, note the period. We are talking about 16th century. In London, he is known as the founder of the metaphysical poets. This was a sort of group, you know. We often call the Romantics, the Victorians. Here, the metaphysical, it's a philosophically driven association of poets. A term that was created by Samuel Johnson, who was an 18th century English essayist, poet and philosopher. So, the term was given by Samuel Johnson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, an important, rather one of the most important figures in English history. Now, metaphysical poets, it's a, at best you can call it a loosely associated group that also included George Herbert, Andrew Marvell and Richard Crashaw, also John Cleveland. So, these are collectively they are known as the metaphysical poets. They are known for their ability to astonish the readers and also to cajole new perspectives, to tease out new perspectives through paradoxical images, subtle arguments and experimental syntax. They were driven by imagery from art, philosophy and religion, and they have come to be associated with an extended metaphor called a conceit. So you should know all these. The conceit of, you very often find this word occurring in literature. Nowadays we use it for pop culture or films also. So the conceit of, or the device of such and such things, such images. So conceit, not to be confused with the more commonplace term conceited, who conceited people are mean spirited. But here conceit is a positive term. Donne reached beyond the rational and hierarchical structures of the 17th century with his conceits, with his astonishing conceits, with his startling conceits and imagery. And whatever was happening in the world around in that period, people experimenting and advancing or pushing the boundaries. So that was also being done in literature. So you can think of all this and associate how important this particular bunch of writers were, the people who were writing during the 15th and 16th century. They too were pushing the boundaries. They too were advancing the exploratory spirit of their times. At the beginning I said I am going to refer to King Lear also, one of the greatest tragedies ever, and adapted in several languages across the world, including in our own country, in our own various or diverse languages. So it's a tragedy composed by Shakespeare in around 1605 or 6. Dates are a little fuzzy, so 1605 or 1606. Written at the height of Shakespeare's tragic period. That was the period between 1601 to 1608. Now again, as usual, I was telling you about Hamlet and his other tragedies also. Material is largely borrowed, the plot is largely borrowed, but then it's what he does, the characters he adds, the language he uses, the atmosphere he creates. That's what makes it or remakes it into a unique drama. Okay? The completed play exploits fully the capacity of this melodramatic genre. Okay? Something that no subsequent writer has been able to do. The play finds its meaning by a deep exploration of the author's own time. It's a commentary on kingship and hierarchies and dynasties. But remember, in both plot and poetry, it develops this meaning with plenty of insight, which is typically Shakespeare. Like, as Ben Jonson said of Shakespeare very highly, he is not of an age but for all time. King Lear is a unique play. It's not of an age but for all time, like most plays or most great tragedies of Shakespeare. The main plot is well known. Of course, it's a medieval chronicle story reworked by several 16th century writers, including Spenser, and also anonymously written by several other minor writers also. The subplot of Gloucester is from Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, which was published in 1590, composed in 1590. Now, two facts have to be noticed here. The first is that the earlier versions of these stories are relatively ill drawn, sketchily drawn, and they cannot be compared with Shakespeare's complex drama. And another thing is that two originally independent stories of Lear and Gloucester are integrated here, thoroughly welded here into one plot. We hardly feel that these are two different stories. One story was dealt with by other writers and the second one by other writers, but how skillfully Shakespeare brings them together, and that's what makes King Lear a great play. We should also understand the interrelationships of Gloucester and Lear and of their children, which is so essential to the play, at the heart of the play is the relationship of these two men with their children, and also the duplication of parental experiences. The other day we were talking about Hamlet, duplication of emotions, Gertrude and Ophelia, the first king and the second king, Claudius, the three sons who are out to avenge the murders of their fathers. Again here there is an ironic duplication of parental experiences with the experience of King Lear and Gloucester. Also we have to note the acceptance of a strong parental authority and a strong royal power. Shakespeare was talking about or cautioning against the division of a united nation or country. Also notice the view that bastardly implies base character, and also note the privileged position of the fool who is free to say whatever he wants, and often shows the mirror to the erring king. Also pay attention to the conception of nature as a universal order which has moral as well as physical, metaphysical manifestations. So these are the things that we have to note. You have to remember we are in the Renaissance age where we have the transition from the medieval to the modern world, and it is precisely such a clash of two distinct periods and ages that we see mirrored in King Lear. The clash of ages is shown in terms of physical age also, one generation in conflict against another. But the play does more than represent the extreme difficulties between two generations. It is more than a family play or a problem family play. In Lear, we find the tragic hero, the pride, okay, which so often characterizes the tragic hero and points to his flaw. All this takes the form of, all these things, they take the form of self-will. Now Lear makes several major errors, but the biggest error is assessing character. He believes that he can retain the privileges of kingship without the responsibilities. He insists that love can be measured both by charming words and by land. Okay, so that's not the way love can be measured. That's what Shakespeare cautions us against. His tragic flaw, Lear's tragic flaw, is the whole being of his daughters. Also, their moral relationship to him is also shown in the fact that only a short time after he miscalculates or takes that very fatal step of dividing his kingdom, and at the same time almost like disinheriting the good daughter, the so-called good daughter. And here he uses a mistaken calculation of love to place the wrong daughters in power. And they too use a mistaken calculation of his need to deprive him of the followers. That was his only symbol of power. Remember how Lear accepts the meaningless hyperboles of his two daughters, unworthy daughters, Goneril and Regan. It clearly reflects that he is suffering from a failure of imagination. He is not able to look beyond mere words. Anyone who flatters or massages his ego is good. In all the suffering that follows, the verbal lashing from the loyal fool, the storm, his nervous breakdown, the mental anguish, actually Lear is recovering his faculties, his imagination, which was not there. So at one point we also find a clash between an imaginative view of life and a calculating view of life, in which value is equated with material advantages. Again, there is a clash between an older order of duties and loyalties represented by Kent, by Cordelia, and eventually by Gloucester, and a newer order in which the only loyalty is to one's own profits and material advantages. So, a great play, although an extremely tragic play. So, I would suggest that you go through the tragedies very carefully. Of course, other plays are important too. Sonnets are also extremely important, but the great tragedies have to be looked into very carefully. From here, we move on to Thomas More's Utopia, 1516, one of the seminal works of the Renaissance literature. Thomas More was born in 1477 and he wrote the first formal Utopia, where he imagined a complex self-contained world set on an island, a blissful island where communities share a common culture and way of life. So, opposed to Utopia is a more recent word, recently coined word, dystopia, okay, where nothing, which is an exact opposite of Utopia. Etymologically, Utopia is a Greek name of More's coining from Utopos, that is no place. More's Utopia describes a pagan and kind of a socialist city-state in which the institutions and policies are governed by reason and logic, not by tyranny. The description of Utopia is represented through a mysterious traveler, Raphael, in support of his argument that equality among people is the only cure against egoism in private and public life. One has to think of the good of the community, the larger, greater good of the community. Through dialogue, More speaks in favor of the mitigation of evil rather than its cure. He believes that human nature is fallible. Some of the topics that More discusses: penology and state controlled education, plurality, way of life, tolerance, the question of divorce, euthanasia and women's rights. So, all these problems are discussed and illustrate many of the systems and practices that More imagined for his utopians. He also defined systems of punishment, various hierarchies, inequalities, injustices, also the state of agriculture and education, and rituals, customs for marriage and death, and rituals in other aspects of life also. Now, when I started the class today, I said that we are going to look at Martin Luther, not is strictly an English author, but of course how so important, you know, the kind of far-reaching influence he had on politics, religion, society, and eventually literature of that period. Martin Luther was born in Germany in a place called Eisleben in 1483. He went on to become one of the most significant figures in the Western history. His father was a businessman, and at age 5, Luther began his education at a local school where he learned reading, writing and Latin, as was the practice among those days, for those days. At 13, Luther began to attend a school run by Brethren of the Common Life in Magdeburg. The Brethren's teachings focused on personal piety, and while Luther developed an early interest in religious life, also monastic life. In 1517, he wrote a document attacking the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences to absolve sin. You can look up the term indulgences because the course is of a limited nature. We cannot be discussing each and every term and concept. So, what were the indulgences and why did Luther protest against the selling of indulgences? He wrote something called 95 Theses, which propounded two central beliefs, that the Bible is the central religious authority and that humans may reach salvation only by the faith and not by by the intermediaries, and this sparked off something called the Reformation. So, on November 9, 1518, the Pope condemned Luther's writing as conflicting with the teachings of the Church. 1 year later, a series of commissions were convened to examine Luther's teachings, and there was a papal commission found and which recognized Luther's writings as heretical, scandalous, offensive. In July 1520, Pope Leo X issued a papal bull, which is also called a public decree that concluded that Luther's propositions were heretical and gave Luther 120 days to recant in Rome. Luther refused to recant, and on January 3rd, 1521, Pope Leo excommunicated Martin Luther from the Catholic Church. In 1521, Luther appeared before the Diet of Worms. It's so called, it's a council which was held at a place called Worms in Germany. So, therefore, Diet of Worms. He again refused to recant and concluded his testimony with the defiant statement, "Here I stand, God help me, I can do no other." On May 25th, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V signed an edict against Luther, ordering his writings to be burned. So, all this was happening as we gradually move towards the beginning of the reign of the first Elizabeth or Elizabeth I. Okay, so before I end up, I would like you to take a look at this link, a brief biography of Elizabeth I. We will meet next and start with the Elizabethan period, the Elizabethan age, where we will be discussing several landmark works of literature especially written during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Thank you very much.